I went to film school. And shockingly, I'm now using, 30 years later, I'm actually using what I learned.
Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. Fred Van Lente is back and to talk about his new book, The Comic Book History of Animation with Ryan Dunleavy.
Hello, Jose. Good to see you.
All right, so you like doing comic book history stuff?
I do. It's true. Last time we talked about my basketball book, and now we're talking about the animation one.
How'd this one come about?
Well, Ryan Dunleavy and I had done, we've done a bunch of these books, including Action Presidents, out now from HarperCollins. We started out with Action Philosophers, and then we did the comic book history of comics. And one day, and that did very well for IDW with us. And one day I was just like, why don't we do animation too? Like, it seemed like a natural companion piece. It's a subject I will totally confess to initially have not being all that interested in. That was really more Ryan's thing. I think Ryan suggested it initially some time ago. But we kickstarted successfully in March the hardback. And so our backers are already getting the issues as they're done. And the rest of the world will be able to get it in regular comics form. It just got bumped to November 25th, the first issue dropping. So about 6 weeks from now.
Everything's getting bumped, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot of, so many comics get printed in Taiwan and China these days, and there's just all this disruption because of COVID, So basketball got bumped 2 weeks for the same reason. Actually, originally that was supposed to come out at the beginning of September. Same thing where the printer they're just getting slammed.
So how is this, like, you mentioned that you weren't initially interested in this one. How did that change, like, as you were going?
I tend to get Stockholm syndrome with all of my subjects. Like, I tend to be like, but then by the end I'm like, this is amazing. Did you know this about Hayao Miyazaki? And so that kind of exactly happened. I've been working on the book for well over a year at this point, because we had to get a significant chunk of it done prior to the Kickstarter. So I'm almost done. I'm on the last chapter of 5 right now, and beginning the great Studio Ghibli rewatch, some of which I've never seen before. Most of the big Miyazakis I'd seen before, but now I'm diving back in.
So it's an international view as well, just like all the other ones, right?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, animation, even more so than comics, has been so heavily dominated by the U.S., and specifically really by Disney. His style and his popularity just kind of completely took over. I mean, Osamu Tezuka, who kind of invented anime to a certain degree, was his biggest single influence was, Disney, and the cliche about anime is right. They all have big eyes, and that's all kind of a translation by way of Tezuka from the style that Disney Studio did, the kind of big, wide-eyed, cutesy animal characters.
That's funny too, because Tezuka's one main American comics connection is Carl Barks.
Oh yeah, you think so?
And I mean, they were friends. They had correspondences and everything. So.
Oh, very cool. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. That's cool. Yeah, no, Tezuka. Tezuka's an interesting guy, and then and then anime didn't really get really big until the mid '70s, and I'm just sort of starting that in my. I'm dealing with the early Japanese animation, like Miyazaki coming up as a key animator. And a layout artist and a designer on really early stuff like Horus, Prince of the Sun, aka North Prince Valiant. That was done for Toei Animation, who did the first feature-length Japanese animated movie, which is Hakuja-den, which in America is translated as Panda and the White Serpent. I guess not translated. It's a completely different title that they slapped on it for no reason.
So here's my question. I asked you the same question with a basketball book. Well, first of all, how many pages is it?
That is a good question. At the moment, it's about scripted. I'm gonna say it's in the. I mean, it's gonna be over 100. Right now, it's like 104. So it's gonna end up being about, once all the supplemental material gets out, it's gonna be like 140, 150. It's actually be very close to the basketball book. It'll be a bit shorter, but.
So same question. Which animators and characters can you not tell this book without?
Okay. Well, I mean, unlike basketball, so the problem with animation, there's really no comparing basketball animation other than the fact I wrote 2 books out about them that are coming out in the fall. Really no connection. I mean, they both got started in the late 1890s, right, with the industrialization of the Western world. Basketball came around in 1891, and animation pretty much got started around 1896. Well, movies did 1896. Windsor Mckay is the most obvious one. He's most famous for creating Little Nemo and Slumberland and being just this spectacular draftsman and one of the most popular cartoonists of the early 20th century. But he was a real kind of savant. Like, he started out as a sign painter in Cincinnati, and his employer would send him out and do ads in the street because he could draw a single picture with one line. Like, he just put the pen on paper, the chalk on paper, and just do a whole scene without ever taking the pen off the paper, right? So he was this incredible, like, that's almost like a freak show act, and he was frustrated at the fact that Little Nemo was a stage production.
It was?
It was a Broadway musical, in the early teens, but it was ridiculously expensive. Like, it was sort of like the Spider-Man musical, the Julie Taymor. It was ridiculously successful, but cost so much money to put on. They broke even barely.
I did not know that. I'm
very
familiar with the comic, but I never knew it was a stage play.
Yeah, I've seen the sheet music. I've never actually heard any of the songs from the show or seen, photographs from the production or anything. But yeah, it was a big deal. It was at the Belasco Theater here in New York. But so McKay decided he would try animation, right? And so Little Nemo, which is this little short film where basically he just draws the characters again by hand in ink, for the first try. Eat your heart out, comic book artist. he just freehands it in ink perfectly and then animates it. But what was funny was that he would have this live act where he did all this stuff. It was called Chalk Talking, and he'd bring Little Nemo in on the act. And human beings, God bless us, we love conspiracy theories. We never want to accept either the evidence of our eyes or what we're told. So in the early days of animation, a lot of people thought that the drawings weren't moving. They were literally like puppets, and they were live filming like puppets. Yeah, I know. But this is early. This is like over 100 years ago, and so this frustrated McKay to no end that people weren't believing that he actually, where basically he hand drew thousands of cells, individual drawings. They weren't technically cells because they weren't in celluloid. He actually drew them on paper. And really, I mean, the comparison is to Jurassic Park. That's how, just as the computer animated dinosaurs in Jurassic Park blew everybody away in 1990, whenever it was, in 1915, whenever it was, it blew people away that McKay would get on stage live and interact with this dinosaur, and he timed his act right. So he was matching he was telling Gertie to dance and eat pumpkins and, annoy a woolly mammoth and all sorts of stuff. So Windsor Mckay, Chuck Jones had a great line, which was,
I know the line.
Yeah, McKay. It was like the first person to crawl out of the primordial ooze was Albert Einstein, and the second was an amoeba. You know, that's how he described Windsor Mckay. So it took years for people to sort of catch up to Windsor Mckay.
Oh, the line I was thinking of was the two most important people in animation are Walt Disney and Windsor Mckay, and I can't tell you which one is first.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So Walt Disney obviously would be another person that you couldn't tell the story without, for obvious reasons. I mean, he was somebody who.
Wait, hold on. Before we get too far from Windsor Mckay, I have to ask. There is an urban legend, and I was wondering if you came across it, and with any evidence of it at all, because it's such a great story. That apparently the first time he ever showed Gertie the dinosaur, people in the theater flipped out and ran because they thought they were looking at a real dinosaur.
That I've never heard. I mean, you get the story that when the French brothers showed their film of the train coming at the camera, the audience ran. Although apparently that's BS. Apparently that didn't actually happen. So yeah, I don't know.
I might be conflating the two. Yes.
I mean, it's quite possible that was a rumor. I didn't see any. I didn't come across it myself, but.
Do you think it's just because the audience back then didn't have the language for it to understand animation?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Also so much of early movies were like what were called trick films, right? They were all like illusions and like it's like a lot of stop. I mean, one of the points we make in our book is that technically all films are animation in the sense that it all exploits what's called the persistence of vision. It's the inability of the human optic system to register distinct images at a certain speed.
Mm-hmm.
So all films are single images, even taken with digital video camera, are all single images that are played back at a certain speed to give the illusion of movement. So technically, Casablanca is animation, right? because Casablanca is just a series, is thousands upon thousands of individual film images. But I think that people think. So I think that particularly what was frustrating McKay so much about people not understanding the concept about animation, it's really people weren't understanding the concept of motion pictures, right?
Oh,
you know what I mean? Like they didn't get that's how movies are just made.
Mm-hmm.
Also they were trained to think of all movies as a trick. You know what I mean? Like in A Trip to the Moon, the Malays film, you really aren't hitting, there really isn't a face in the moon, and there really isn't a a space capsule slamming into his eye, and there's lots of other stuff like there's a famous early stop motion film called The Haunted Mansion, I think, or The Haunted House, where through stop motion animation it looks like an empty house is coming to life, the chairs. Another animator by the name of Emil Kolb, who was really a super important animator, probably the biggest animator outside of the US, like Windsor Mckay, a very famous cartoonist. So he was a political cartoonist, unlike McKay. Did a great film called the Dancing Matches that were sort of similar, where and it's about this wizard comes and makes matches dance. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward stop motion film, but again, the audiences in those days were trained to think that these were sort of almost the opposite, that it was that they're all bullshit, So they had a very heavy. That's why I doubt anyone ran out of the theater when Gertie showed up, because they were trained to think of everything as fake. You know what I mean? It's like they didn't have that. It's almost like it always drives me crazy. Like when people slag like the early Godzilla movies, like it's like, well, it looks like it's a guy in a suit. Well, like it is a guy in a suit. Like what do you think? Is that Godzilla isn't real? Like what's wrong with you? Like I never understand that. It's like it looks, it's so he's clearly smashing models. What's because he is smashing models. Like what do you think? You're some kind of genius? You figured that out? So it's interesting. So the suspension of disbelief aspect of animation, it took a little while to get started,
Mm-hmm.
And sorry.
Yeah. No, I was saying, and you were saying Disney.
Yeah, and so between Windsor Mckay and, say, the silly symphony stuff that Disney was doing, most animation is pretty awful. Like, it's just not, because it's so time consuming and expensive. Only you had to be half insane to want to do it, and Disney really was kind of half insane for animation. Like, he was really into the sort of idea of simulating life, right? Like, one of his art directors said that he really didn't like to see drawings up on stage on screen. He wanted the characters to be as real as possible, you know. And in some cases, that was taking the rotoscoping process that was developed by his main rival, Max Fleischer, and using that in key scenes in Snow White, for example, for the human characters. Rotoscoping is a process by which you film a model or an actor doing stuff, and then you actually draw over it. So it's sort of animation in reverse, right? You're filming something and then tracing it and then refilming it, the resulting drawings.
And that means you can exaggerate it and take liberties with the art, I'm supposing?
No, quite the opposite, actually. It's the most realistic form of animation, ironically, is just filming real people and tracing it, you know, and then refilming those drawings. Then you get that. Another really famous rotoscoping bit is, if you've ever seen Fleischer's one of his two features, Gulliver's Travel, Gulliver is rotoscoped and is clearly a human dude, you know, doing stuff that they've traced over, and then all the Lilliputians and all the other creatures he encounters are all just straight up drawn. And that's sort of that actually is really effective in that film to sort of do that story of Gulliver kind of stuck in this world where he's a giant, you know, because everything else is so tiny.
I'll look that up. I'm a big Max Fleischer Superman fan. So
yes, and it bankrupted Max Fleischer's studio because he had to rotoscope. Paramount wanted him to rotoscope every single character, and he was like, "This is bananas. Like, this is gonna ruin me," and it did. He was right. But he didn't really have a choice because he was on the ropes with Paramount to begin with. So and they had acquired the rights from DC Comics. They basically made him do it. And so if you watch the Fleischer cartoons, as terrific as they are, there's a lot of like shadows being animated. You know, he desperately tried to cut corners wherever he could, but the films, these are 6-7 minute movies that cost $100,000 and even in 1940s money, that was like bananas, you know. So very quickly Paramount shut him down. And
it surprised and depressed me to know that like they actually hated doing it.
Yes. Yeah. But most of the shorts still really hold up today, you know. My favorite one is still the one where the Native American mad scientist is going to blow up Manhattan if they don't give it back to him.
I'm actually really surprised because, like, for a 1941 cartoon, the fact that they had a Native American who wasn't, you know, covered in feathers and tribal paint.
And was living in, like, an underwater lab with his murder machines.
I was like, wow.
That's pretty great.
Good for you guys.
And the Fleischer cartoons also have my favorite Lois Lane depiction ever. And the Superman, Clark Kent and Lois were actually both voiced by by Jane Alexander and Bud Collyer, who did their voices for the radio show, The Adventures of Superman. And then later did the voices for the New Adventures of Superman, which is the Filmation cartoon from 1966.
Oh, really?
So they had a long career. What's that? Yeah, it's the same people. Same actors, yeah. Anyway, I love the Fleischer Lois because she literally has like the self-destructive impulses of a toddler. Like she's always just like and it's just instinctual. She's always like in the big top that's on fire, or in the mad scientist's sub, or hiding away in a flying robot, and to the point where it's not like she's waiting for Superman to save her. You really ask yourself, how is this woman still alive before Superman showed up? Because she just is constantly just running into traffic. Always.
I will get this story or die.
That exactly. It says she's just the luckiest woman on earth, apparently.
Who else can't you tell this story without? I'm assuming Iwerks.
Yeah, Ub Iwerks was an interesting guy. He was Walt Disney's best friend in Kansas City, in the sense that in the sense Disney had any friends, which he was a sort of a notoriously difficult person. But Ub, you know, Ub and Disney started a company making like advertising animation, and really Disney got his start out there in Kansas City. And once Disney moved out west and was able to sell his first cartoon series to the biggest person in animation at the time, which was actually a woman, an executive named Margaret Winkler, who had worked for Warner Brothers. He convinced Ub to move to LA with him. LA was the hotspot for movies in America, partly because of the sunlight and the fact it didn't rain a whole lot, so you'd shoot outside a lot, but also because Thomas Edison in New Jersey was suing everyone who attempted to make movies because he said he was violating their patents. And so in those days, you could sometimes escape lawsuits by going very far away from the person who was suing you. Today, it's a little bit harder to do that, but with the emails.
Edison was terrible.
Edison was a cranky dude. He was very aggro, and finally they were able, in the teens at some point, were able to do a sort of an overall licensing deal so people could make movies and not get sued by Edison. But Ub designed Mickey Mouse, directed the first Steamboat Willie, the first Mickey. He directed Silly Symphonies, which arguably is a far superior series to Mickey. Mm-hmm. Because the idea was so Disney was the first person to popularize sound cartoons. Steamboat Willie was not the first sound cartoon, but it was the first mega popular one. And so Silly Symphonies was an idea by Carl Stalling, who was Disney's music director, who also was a Kansas City guy. Stalling would later go on, and his main claim to fame, other than the Silly Symphonies, would be he music directed the Looney Tunes forever and ever and ever. So Stalling had the idea of, why don't we take a piece of music and animate to it? It's almost like the sound version of rotoscoping, right?
Yeah.
Rather than adding a score to a movie afterwards, you write a piece of music and then animate to it, And Stalling also invented a click track, which is sort of how you sync sound to the picture. In fact, it was so associated with Disney. It was called Mickey Mousing for a long time. Sort of that was sort of before the slate, right, came along. Mm-hmm. That's how you sync up movies and sound and the picture track and the soundtrack today. I went to film school, and shockingly, I'm now using 30 years later. I'm actually using what I learned. But Ub, Disney made sure his name was slapped on all the movies first, and Ub just got sick of sharing the credit with him. Struck out on his own, and unfortunately, the complaint is that there's a lot of Disney apologists. I don't mean to shock you, in people who love Disney in the animation field, and they say, well, Ub was a great draftsman, but he had no story sense, or he wasn't, funny. Like his cartoons weren't funny, and all that may very well be true. But to me, the bottom line is success is very difficult to replicate in any circumstance. And so he just, to a certain extent, somebody like, it's comparable to somebody like Jack Kirby, right?
Who was
getting sick of dealing with Stan Lee, and so quit and went on his own. And, his comics that he did for DC and Pacific and later on at Marvel were all incredibly inventive and by their own standards popular, but he never replicated that as success. And frankly, neither did Stan Lee. And frankly, neither did Walt Disney after, World War II, really. People forget that Snow White was a huge hit, but Pinocchio bombed. Fantasia bombed.
Alice in Wonderland.
Bambi bombed. And then later on, I don't think Alice in Wonderland ever did very well. Dumbo actually did very well, but then he had more bombs. Sleeping Beauty bombed. The Song of the South bombed.
I'm really surprised that Sleeping Beauty bombed, because didn't they build Disney World around that movie?
Sort of. I mean,
like, that's her castle.
I think it's sure. in Disneyland, yes, in California.
Oh,
Sleeping
Disneyland. Yeah, I meant
Castle.
Disneyland. Yeah.
In Disney World, it's I think it's Snow White's castle, or is it Cinderella's castle? I don't remember. Anyway, don't really care, to be honest with you.
Mhm.
but no, actually,
Really surprised at it.
well, it's if you go to Cinderella's castle at Disneyland, they actually have a lovely. I actually really like how they laid it out, where it's stills from the film and stuff. Because Disneyland and Sleeping Beauty opened more or less simultaneously in the mid '50s. Actually, no, I think Disneyland opened 4 years before Sleeping Beauty premiered. Anyway, Sleeping Beauty, which they spent all this money on. It's the first Disney feature to use a lot of Xerox technology, because Xeroxing had just been invented. And so you could fire a lot of the animators and just literally replace them with machines. Because before you had to, hand draw, a million, frames of dragons fighting a Prince Charming. But now you could sort of Xerox it, and they used Xeroxing a lot in 101 Dalmatians, as you might imagine. And it was Ub Iwerks, so I never finished the Ub Iwerks story. So Ub Iwerks, he started his own studio, but it bombed, and he was teaching at a vocational school before he talked Disney to give him his job back. So Ub never directed again, but he was the head of technical projects at Disney, and he, among many other things, invented the process by which you could photocopy images directly onto celluloid as opposed to paper. And then that kind of saved animation at Disney, because Sleeping Beauty bombed, and the Shaggy Dog with Fred McMurray, which was made for like a third of Sleeping Beauty's cost, came out the same year and was one of the highest grossing films of that year. It was either 59 or 60. And so if you wonder where all those terrible like Disney family live action comedies come from, it was from the success of the Shaggy Dog. I mean, which is not a great movie, but if you're going to make a movie about a teenager who turns into a dog when the moon is full, you could do worse. Then it's to fight communists, because of course he does. It's 1959, and Disney famously hated commies. But
I think I prefer Teen Wolf. No.
That's right. Teen Wolf is very similar to the Shaggy Dog, but with more basketball.
But with more basketball.
That's why you like it.
Of course.
I still don't think I've actually ever seen Teen Wolf all the way through. Yet I have seen the Shaggy Dog. So it was more sort of relevant to my research for that book. So success, kids, not necessarily replicable, as we can see in the may look like Disney was all just puppy dogs and rainbows for him, but no, I mean the studio struggled a lot, and it would have gone out of business if it was not producing all sorts of military films during World War II. It absolutely would have gone under if it wasn't for the U.S. military.
The thing I've heard about both Ub and Jack is that it's not really so much the story sense or whatever. It's that they weren't the marketers that Walt and Stan were. Would you agree?
Sure.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Although, again, Walt was a good boss in the sense that he was able to sort of delegate to the people who worked for them and get them to realize his personal vision. Stan, to a certain degree, sort of had that. They both Stan and Walt had these kind of Pied Piper
personas.
Thank you. Yeah, about them. And even today, when I talk to people who knew Stan personally and worked for him, and right up until the point where he died, they just, they're just glowing in their praise of him. There's a lot sort of a father figure kind of, feeling about them. But really fiercely creative people. The father figure, inspires love and fear, right? In dual amounts, and people like Kirby, you just chafe under that level of, domination. And so they leave, and then, but again, you can't always or ever really walk away from that level of success and expect, I'm just going to do it again. Very few people are sort of a Steve Jobs, right, who walks away from Apple and does Pixar, and speaking to think of an animation example, and then goes back to Apple and has a great second life. I mean, Stan Lee, unless you count She-Hulk and Stripperella, didn't really do much after 1969, leaving sort of the helm of being editor-in-chief of Marvel. So it works, it cuts both ways,
Yeah.
Fortunately, Disney was successful enough in his studio, and they sort of carved out a niche for themselves as sort of the family-friendly studio and so they had a very specific part of the market that they dominated. They were sort of able to get through all of their many problems.
And they've been around like for so long, and now they're buying everything up.
Yeah. Yep. And now they own Marvel and Pixar. Well, I guess they started with Pixar, right? And they have Marvel and Lucasfilm and now 20th Century Fox.
It's like how pivotal, was it The Little Mermaid that kickstarted their
Yeah, absolutely. They sort of went back to their roots with a certain degree of formula. I don't think you can discount the composers. You've now moved outside of the realm I've researched, so I'm going to screw up a lot of names and dates because it's a realm I have. That's the 5th issue. But I don't, the Little Shop of Horror guys, the composers whose names are escaping me, don't count out their contributions to that success, right? Was the songs and the fact that they really started thinking of these movies as movie musicals and not, they almost thought of it, started thinking of them as musicals first and children's films second, That whole idea of what is a children's film is kind of a weird, mushy, kind of, you're sort of trying to emulate what Walt was doing. And it was something that somebody like Hayao Miyazaki has always been very, into, and has always been kind of the anti-Disney and I mean, Miyazaki, let's just face it, kind of hates everything. So he's a very intense guy who is very kind of there's a great essay he wrote about Mr. Bug Goes to Town, which is one of his favorite films. It's the second Fleischer feature, which is kind of a great. Actually, both the Fleischer features are really well done. I actually really like Mr. Bug Goes to Town, but he writes this essay, and then by the end of the essay, it's almost like Miyazaki's talked himself out of liking the movie. He starts by praising it, but by the end of it, he's like, "Yeah, it's not that great." But that's that kind of uncompromising vision, right? That is what contributes to really creative people a lot of the times.
What about Chuck Jones?
Yeah, I mean, Chuck Jones is the greatest, probably the greatest director of the Looney Tunes, of the short. He's probably the greatest director of short cartoons, which was the primary format of animation. Starting in the teens, really going all the way up into the. I mean, really, the Flintstones, Hanna-Barbera's The Flintstones, is the first thing to kind of break from that format. Even on TV, everything was in 7 minutes because the early TV animation, the networks just bought lock, stock, and barrel, in a lot of cases. The shorts, the theatrical shorts that were shown in the movie theaters, and they just migrated them onto the TV set. Yeah, I mean, Jones was really influential in his experimentation with backgrounds. Maurice Noble was one of his main background guys. He created not Bugs Bunny, but the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, and sort of that great kind of like abstract marriage of pure character. The characters never spoke, and they had these very simple rules. Wile E. Coyote could never succeed, and he always injured himself as a result of his own actions. He also, the other rule, I missed until I started researching the book. The other rule is that the Roadrunner, if you'll notice, never leaves the road.
Really?
She always stays, and she's canonically female, which I did not realize.
I didn't know that.
Another thing I learned that she never leaves the road. She's always
on the road.
She never goes Baja. She always is right down the yellow strip, right on the road, which is sort of fascinating. And then the other thing is that he is in 1994. A panel of 1,000 animators voted for the best cartoons of all time, and the first two were both Chuck Jones movies. The first was What's Up, or Doc, from 1957, and the second one was Duck Amuck, which is a really interesting film in a lot of ways. It's the movie where Daffy's fighting with the animator the whole time, and you pull out at the end, and it's Bugs as the animator. What's neat about Duck Amuck, and I doubt this was, I mean, I guess I could be wrong. I don't think I am. What's sort of fascinating about Duck Amuck is that it really is a throwback to the earliest days of animation, when the original animated films like Little Nemo and stuff were basically these chalk talking routines with a hand coming down and drawing all of the characters. You know what I mean? Yeah. So Duck Amuck in many ways is an OG kind of, a very old concept, or almost an original animation concept, just done really, really, really well.
Wow. I mean, I've seen the Little Nemo short, and I've seen Duck Amuck a billion times.
Sure.
But I never made that connection. That's true. Another thing you were saying about it being difficult to replicate success. Have you ever heard of a Looney Tunes cartoon called Rabbit Rampage?
I don't think so.
It's Duck Amuck, except it's Bugs Bunny, and nobody's ever heard of it, even though it's the exact same thing.
I'm writing that down. It's Rabbit Rampage.
Yeah, even though it's the exact same thing, nobody's ever heard of it.
I'll look that up on HBO Max. It has all the Looney Tunes. That kind of thing weirds me out, right? Like, because like why wouldn't this be known at all? If I mean, do you think it's as good as Duck Amuck?
I don't think so, because I think that Bugs is not a character that should lose like that. And
sure, that's a good point.
And Daffy is. That's
Daffy is always the butt of the joke, and Bugs is always putting one up on the other guy. Yeah, I guess that they are in their own way, the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, respectively. Right? One can't win and the other can't lose.
But the thing that I really wanted to ask going into this was, what was the I was having a hard time trying to figure out, what did Chuck Jones actually do to be so influential, because I can't concretize it. I can't figure out what the concrete thing was.
Right. A lot of it was that he was one of the only Warner's animators who could actually draw really well. So he could define, because to be an animation director, you really, I mean, the way the Warner's system was set up is the director would sketch out a lot of times the scenes, but then you'd have somebody called the layout man who would basically be the artist who would finalize all the drawings. That was the job that Hayao Miyazaki had when he was starting out. And the guy, and I can't remember the guy's name, Tawazaka, maybe, the guy who the co-founder of Ghibli, was the director that Miyazaki would work for a lot when they were first starting out in Toei, and when they were doing Heidi, Girl of the Alps, and a lot of their TV shows before they founded Ghibli. So Jones had all these great people working with him. So he was like the guy who came up with the building, and then the layout man was the architect, and all the other artists were basically the construction crew, right? Who would go in and actually achieve the building. He was the most open to innovation. He was the biggest character. Like, that's sort of the Stan Leeization of it, right? Is that if you're a big personality, people tend to gravitate towards you.
Chuck Jones.
Chuck Jones, yeah, had a kind of a big personality, was very charming and witty, and was a very good artist, and he was willing to experiment. He knew that, like, one of the tricks was he kind of had the Roadrunner thing down pat, so he could actually manipulate his schedule to do these crazy movies like What's Opera Doc that would take so much more time and energy. But the Warner's executives left him alone as long as he kept delivering. Like, they ignored them completely as long as they kept delivering these shorts on time and under budget. So Jones was a master of tricking the suits by manipulating his schedule so he could do a Roadrunner cartoon in half the time allotted to him, but then move that time and give that to a What's Up, a Doc or a Duck Amuck. So it was a combination of different things. I mean, I see your point, is that it's hard to sort of put your finger on what exactly it was, but I think it was all those factors combined.
I also want to thank Chuck Jones because all of my knowledge of opera comes from What's Opera Doc.
I mean, I may have slight more. For me, it's What's Up and Fantasia. The only ways I know the operas.
Fantasia is another one. Do you spend a lot of time on Fantasia, or?
I mean, a little bit. It nearly, like Superman, it nearly broke the studio. Fantasia was the first motion picture in stereo, which sounds awesome until you realize no theaters were equipped with stereo. So they literally had to put the sound system in a truck and drive it. You could only show it in 13 theaters, like at a time or something, because the sheer amount of equipment, and you had to have an entire army of guys, technicians show up to your theater and install it. It was just bananas. And so of course it bombed because it cost so much money to make and then to show. And critics hated it, because it's this, I think Fantasia is really boring because you have this gorgeous music married to kind of
Nothing.
the most pedestrian interpretation. Like even the interpretation of the music is not terribly interesting.
Yeah.
So for lovers of classical music, it's like, but for people just like cartoons, that's really boring because there's no story and you're just listening to this classical music, So it's the first time Disney was accused, because people forget that in the 30s Disney was hailed as this great intellectual through Snow White and Three Little Pigs and a lot of his other films. He was sort of hailed as this sort of brand new artist. But once Fantasia came out, that's when he started getting the reputation as this kind of middle brow, this kind of milk toast, the strained peas version of cinema,
Maybe kind of pretentious.
Well, or like, this kind of like middle American, boring, not taking risks. At least pretentious people are trying. People accuse Disney of not even doing that.
Yeah, the one thing I really remember from Fantasia, I guess The Sorcerer's Apprentice, but I keep forgetting it's from there. But Chernobog, because that gave me nightmares as a child.
Yes, it's a scary, physically based on Bela Lugosi, designed by one of the only female animators at Disney, whose name is escaping me. Her name is on a book on my shelf. Let me see here. Oh, can't see. Anyway,
okay.
yes, I could get over there, but I'd have to unhook my headset.
So who do we move on to after Chuck Jones and Walt Disney?
Well, William Hanna and Joe Barbera, you really can't tell the story of TV animation without them. They were the heads of MGM. They created Tom and Jerry. And then they got summarily fired during this period when the studios were all phasing out their shorts or selling them to Hollywood. Fortunately, there was a market for original animation, so Barbera and Hanna were able to basically rehire all of their MGM employees and start a studio named after themselves.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I thought that was one guy and a Barbera.
That's right. Well, why not, right?
Yeah.
And they very quickly got it. So the murderous schedule of television and the stingy budgets meant they had to do a lot of limited animation. Famously, like just the mouths move. The same shot of characters running with the background scrolling by, that kind of stuff. But they were sort of the kings of animation. They were rivaled really only by Filmation, which was
even worse with that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, that was really spearheaded by a guy named Lou Scheimer, who started out working for Hanna-Barbera on Rough and Ready, which was their first first Hanna-Barbera show. And then the pressure got so great they kept shipping more and more stuff overseas, out of the U.S. to Australia, and the Philippines was a major destination for that. Mexico. I think at one point Hanna-Barbera was 3/4 of their animation was being done outside the U.S. just to save costs with the currency exchange rate. But the animation unions really freaked out, and it sort of is partly why Japan's been able to eat America's lunch in the animation realm since about the mid 70s, was because
of the cost.
The cost and the fact that Miyazaki makes a big point of pointing out that a lot of the people who, and the same is true really in America, but a lot of people in Japanese animation just love it, and so you can frankly pay them shit and they'll take it, as long as they can keep working in the industry,
Yeah.
And by the end of the late 70s, a lot of Japanese animation was being farmed out to Taiwan and the Philippines and elsewhere in Asia, because the pressure is so ridiculous. And that's what someone like Miyazaki was really reacting against. He was reacting both against the content of animated films and sort of the relentless factory-like, effort to sort of crank it out,
Mm-hmm.
Filmation managed to, another reason they claim part of the reason they had such limited animation, like you were saying, was that kept costs and allowed them to keep most of those jobs in the US. But by the end of the 80s, they were farming it to South Korea.
That's interesting. I know, the first animated series I know for a fact was animated here was X-Men, the animated series, just because I went to the studio. So that's when I realized.
Oh, nice.
They were farming these things out. But going back to
they would. I mean, a lot of it was very piecemeal. What they called it in Hollywood was called a runaway production, and so a lot of it was very like piecemeal, right? So in the Philippines, you would get colorists, right? So you'd send the cell. The cells would be inked either elsewhere in Asia or in the United States, and then you'd send them to a coloring studio in the Philippines, and they would, paint them in, and then send them off onto their journey, wherever the next stop in the world their journey was in. So it's, X-Men may very well have been where the whole process was totally located in the Philippines, but the Philippines was definitely involved in animation,
Yeah, it was X-Men and Biker
decades.
Mice from Mars.
Nice.
But getting back to William Hanna and Joe Barbera, one of the things that fascinates me sometimes a lot is finding out that something was much bigger at a time than we remember it now. And one of my go-to examples for that is the Flintstones.
Sure.
That was revolutionary, right? I'm not making this up, or
yeah, no, it was a huge hit. As most people know, it was copied. It was a sitcom format, largely copied from the Honeymooners, which was this classic Jackie Gleason show from the 50s. It really only ran for one season, which is partly why there was such a hunger for that material, is that Gleason kind of ended the Honeymooners like after, I think there's like 30 episodes of the Honeymooners, not a lot. And that's a fact that shocked me, having seen it on reruns, forever. Never actually watched, but I never actually watched one, so that's how I never noticed there weren't very many of them. Yeah, I mean, the Flintstones was the first original primetime show, and it lasted for, I think, 7 seasons, something in that ballpark. Critics hated it. It was a huge ratings hit. And then another thing people may not necessarily know is that Hanna-Barbera tried then to replicate the success of the Flintstones with a bunch of other primetime shows. Like Top Cat was originally a primetime cartoon based on the old Sergeant Bilko show. The Jetsons obviously was the Flintstones in the future. And Johnny Quest was originally an attempt to do a primetime adventure cartoon. And they all bombed. None of them, again, sort of the theme of this podcast, right, is it's hard to replicate success because none of it worked. People love the Flintstones, but did not really take the Jetsons. So they migrated that to Saturday mornings, which quickly in the US became when you would air cartoons. There was a guy by the name of Fred Silverman, very big in television history, who came up with the idea of, we're going to do our own original shows. We're not just going to keep rerunning Looney Tunes from the 40s over and over and over again. We're going to pay Hanna-Barbera and Filmation, some of these other studios, to do because before the home of animation was After School.
Yeah.
But then slowly it began migrating. Really, they began focusing very heavily on Saturday mornings.
And that was spearheaded by things like the Jetsons, Johnny Quest.
Well, that was sort of the harbinger of it, because they would move. Those were originally primetime shows. Like the first giant Saturday morning hit actually was Filmation's New Adventures of Superman.
Oh, okay.
That came out in '66, and we had mentioned that earlier, and had a lot of like limited animation, and a lot of those early Filmation shows. Like if anyone here has DC Universe, watch the Filmation Aquaman show. It's so nuts.
Is that the one where he throws water balls in the underwater?
Oh yeah.
Impossible Aquaman.
And that they did that underwater effect by smearing baby oil on a blank acetate and then putting it over the film, and that's how they got those underwater effects in Aquaman. Baby oil. But yeah, those were all written by DC Comics writers, and so they're all like. And I'm doing a column right now in the Nick Cardy Aquaman series in the '60s, which is just the most insane thing you've ever seen. Like, what are these guys smoking? And it's crazy when you think that these comics were coming out at the same time as like the Jack Kirby Fantastic Fours and the Steve Ditko Spider-Mans. They just come from different planets. It's amazing.
So moving on to after the Flintstones, you mentioned Filmation and Saturday morning cartoons. What was your favorite Saturday morning cartoon?
Oh, Super Friends.
Oh, that makes sense.
Which weirdly was when, so DC was playing both ends against the middle, right? So Hanna-Barbera had Super Friends, but Filmation had Batman. They were doing the New Adventures of Batman that actually had Adam West and Burt Ward as the voices. A deeply terrible cartoon that no one should ever watch. But it's also on DC Universe, which is only going to be, DC Universe is really only going to be around for the next 3 months. So I keep bringing it up. Watch it now. I don't know how much that stuff's going to wind up on HBO. Will HBO now do the Filmation Aquaman show? I don't know. So Filmation had the Joker and Catwoman, I think the Penguin, but Super Friends had the Riddler. And that's why the Riddler and the Scarecrow are in the Legion of Doom, along with Sinestro and Lex Luthor, and not like bigger Batman villains, because Filmation had the rights to them. For anyone who cares.
I gotcha.
And I sat and watched all 9 seasons of Super Friends on DC Universe this year as part of my pandemic time killing, and man,
I thought you were going to say that you watched it for your research, and I was going to say I don't believe you.
No, I did not. They're bad, man. They do not hold up. There are no Filmation Aquaman cartoons. I'll tell you that much. And so that's kind of a bummer. Totally did not hold. I loved Thundar,
the Barbarian,
the show created by Steve Gerber, one of my big influences, a comics writer. Designed, the main character was designed by Alex Toth, but then all the other stuff was designed by Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
That was done at Ruby Spears, I believe. Ruby Spears were the showrunners of a show called Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?
I was wondering when that was going to come up.
Which was created in 1969 or no, 68 because they needed to fill slots in their schedule because the parents groups came very heavily out against the superheroes. Oof. The superhero shows were very big in 66, 67, 68, but they're like, it's too violent. So bye-bye Space Ghosts. Goodbye Aquaman. Goodbye,
This is so funny to me because everybody acts like the latest generation is the most offended generation ever. But then, like, if you just keep going back, there's always these groups that cause these massive changes just out of complaining for the safety of their children.
Yep. That happens every generation. The new generation of parents wants to get rid of whatever is new and terrifying. And then Filmation's biggest hit though was He-Man by far. Yeah. He-Man was arguably the most successful kids cartoon of all time in terms of ratings. Yeah, in terms of ratings, it outdrew the newscast. It was on after school. But they had banked enough episodes because Mattel was basically bankrolling it to promote the toy line, and Filmation got it because Filmation had done this barbarian cartoon called Black Star that Mattel had done toys for. And so when they came up with He-Man, essentially as a kid's Conan line, because sure, why not? They tapped Filmation to do the cartoon for it. And by that point, there had been federal regulations essentially restricting the ability of cartoons to be essentially 30-minute long ads. But then old Ronald Reagan got elected president, and he did away with all that. So then G.I. Joe and Thundercats, Transformers, and all that stuff, were all basically ads for their various toy lines. And He-Man, I find He-Man totally unwatchable. Even as a kid, I was too old by that point to really get into He-Man.
I don't know, like I see He-Man the same way you see Filmation Aquaman.
It's just bonkers. Yeah, no, I believe it. Yeah.
It's just so ridiculous. And then I see the rest of them, like G.I. Joe and Transformers, the same way you see Super Friends, which is like, you're trying to be good, but you're really not.
Yeah, Super Friends, it's definitely like I would basically lived for Saturday mornings to watch this show, and now you're just like, what? Why? Why was I so into this? This makes no sense.
Do you go past the turn of the century much at all for American cartoons in the book, in the comic?
Well, I have basically written and researched up until basically when Filmation went out of business in 1988. So I have not.
Okay.
So maybe ? We'll see.
So not the 90s either. So you haven't gotten to Batman the Animated Series. Correct.
Not yet. But we'll definitely be talking about that. Much of the fifth issue will be taken over by Miyazaki, probably, who I think I think he is without a doubt the greatest filmmaker in the medium of animation in animation history. So we sort of spend a lot of time on Disney, who's sort of the most influential figure. And then we sort of end with Miyazaki, who I think is the greatest artist.
I was going to say, moving on to Japan like that, same question. We were talking about who's more important, with McKay or Disney. Who is more important, Tezuka or Miyazaki?
I mean, you wouldn't have a an animation industry in Japan without Tezuka, so it's hard not to say Tezuka, but I mean, Miyazaki's films are better, so it's like, what are we picking here? Are we picking on the base of, would I rather watch a Miyazaki film or a Tezuka film? Well, absolutely, I'd rather watch a Miyazaki film. Yeah, the comparison to McKay is actually a little bit closer than you might think, because like McKay, Astro Boy had been a live action TV show that Tezuka was very unhappy with, and that's why he founded Mushi Productions, and that's why he made Astro Boy into a cartoon. Very similar to how McKay was very dissatisfied with the live stage version of Little Nemo. So the McKay Tezuka comparison is, what I like to say about Osamu Tezuka is, it's what if Will Eisner, Walt Disney and Windsor Mckay were the same guy. That's basically Tezuka's place in comics history and Japanese cultural history.
Actually, when people talk about the greatest comics artist of all time, I'm like, and everyone debates these American artists. I'm like, it's Tezuka, because he's all of those guys in one.
I know, and what's sad is there's a lot of hostility. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Miyazaki can't stand him, but as I said, Miyazaki can't stand anybody, so it's not it's not really saying a whole lot. Tezuka, there was a huge reaction against him with the Gigaka movement in Japan against his comics. Like, he's such a big deal that he has also inspired, I guess not unlike Walt Disney, he's inspired this massive backlash, and particularly among American manga fans. They're just like, bleh, like they're just, he's lived long enough to become the villain, to steal Harvey Dent's line from Dark Knight. He's not obviously still alive, but his shadow has definitely grown way beyond him. You know what I mean? But I think that it's definitely Tezuka sort of more important in terms of because Miyazaki kind of rejects anime kind of as a concept unto itself. I mean, he has no truck with giant robots and spaceships, and
Yeah.
just kind of holds his nose at all that stuff. He just sees it as
A
he
medium.
sees it. Well, he sees it as emblematic of a sick culture, as people who are obsessed with power, right? Miyazaki's an old school kind of lefty, you know. His parents, ironically, his parents built his family's Miyazaki airplanes built the fan belts and rudders for the planes that attacked Pearl Harbor and were responsible for a lot of the Japanese war machine during World War II. And so Miyazaki has very much reacted very, very vehemently against that, and is, you know, disgusted by a lot of the kind of very violent and warlike tendencies of a lot of anime.
So you'd say Tezuka more important, Miyazaki better.
Yes, I would. I mean, better is obviously just my own personal opinion, but I
would agree with that. He's just insanely good.
Yes.
You have a favorite Miyazaki film?
Porco Rosso.
Okay. It's
I mean, Miyazaki's obsessed with three things: children, planes, and nature. And I guess I'm not as sort of enamored as with kids as he is. Porco Rosso also, it's very rare. I don't generally like watching foreign films dubbed into English, but Michael Keaton's performance as Porco Rosso is so good in the English dub of Porco Rosso that I highly recommend it.
We usually prefer subtitles.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, Porco Rosso is Italian. He's not talking Japanese or English. So what does it matter what language he's actually speaking? You know.
Yeah, I remember. You know, because most Disney movies give you, you know, they have variety, but they give you kind of the same feel good feeling at the end. I remember the first two Miyazaki films I saw were Spirited Away, and then I was like, oh, I want more of this. So I watched Princess Mononoke,
which I've never seen. I'm excited because I'm going to watch it for the first time as part of the research for this.
Well, I'll just say it feels nothing like Spirited Away, and it made me feel like I stepped into a grinder and got beaten up a lot. So,
I've heard that, yeah. Well, and in Osco Valley of the Wind is no walk in the park either.
Mm-hmm.
If you're really, what I'm really loving, and I'm only about halfway through it, is Future Boy Conan.
Okay, I haven't seen that one.
Watching on, it never made it into English. I'm watching it on YouTube with the bootleg dub, or not a dub, a translation in subtitles. And I think it's amazing. Like it was Miyazaki's directorial debut. It was a TV show that ran in the 70s in Japan.
Do you cover also the relationship between anime and Western animation? Like just the crossover between the two?
I mean, Miyazaki's a huge influence on John Lasseter and the whole Pixar guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about the whole
thing? And Akira obviously is huge here.
What about the whole thing where like 80s cartoons were basically anime brought over and redubbed?
Well, I mean, there was a bunch of that, right? There was Battle of the Planets and Star Blazers. I mean, Star Blazers is arguably the most significant piece of animation in Japanese history because it basically was the first anime. Space Battleship Yamato, which came in 1974, and is sort of an interesting psychological cultural element, right? Of like this super battleship that was supposed to win World War II for Japan, although I think a lot of the Imperial Navy was like, man, this isn't going to fly. This isn't going to work. Anyway, it gets destroyed, right? And it gets buried. And then when aliens invade, sure, why not? Earth, they build this savior colony ship under the remains of the actual battleship Yamato. And so, you know, when the space battleship Yamato comes out and that sort of iconic shot in the credits, it's like, it's very much like sort of, you know, Japan kind of trying to rewrite its history through fantasy, and it's psychological. Like I said, psychologically fascinating.
Here's my last question about animation. We've been talking a lot about the animators and the characters and the technology. Actually, do you spend time on the voice actors?
Not as much as we should. Not really. No.
But
spend a lot of time on the technology and the filmmakers. Yeah.
But if you were to spend time on the voice actors, who is the greatest voice actor ever? I feel like I know the answer to this.
Well, I mean, it's hard not to go with Mel Blanc, right?
Yeah.
Because without him, you don't have some of those characters. But then the other guy, the guy who did Huckleberry Hound, is terrific, and he did a lot of Hanna-Barbera stuff. I think he was on the Flintstones too.
Who was Mel Blanc? It was Barney.
And Mel Blanc was Barney. That's right. And the guy who played the Flintstone, Fred, actually ad-libbed Yabba Dabba Doo. It was the script said Yahoo, and so he actually added Yabba Dabba Doo.
Really?
Himself.
Very cool. And wait, my actual last question about animation is: in the course of your life, how many times have you been greeted with "Hey, Fred" in a Barney voice?
Almost never, because I grew up in the 80s. I got Freddy Krueger a lot.
Oh, okay.
Was the Fred that I got. And then when I went to college, Wright said Fred.
That's even worse.
I'm too sexy for my shirt was the go-to Fred. So I vastly would have preferred the Barney Rubble greeting.
So this book will be out in 6 weeks.
In comics form.
In comics form, yeah.
In floppy, the first issue is out. It's a 5-issue miniseries. The first issue is out November 22nd.
November 22nd, first
or
issue
whatever that Wednesday is.
The week of November 22nd, the Wednesday of November 22nd.
It got bumped. It's actually one of my top emails.
And okay. Moving on, we talked about Jack Kirby, and you are responsible for a play about Jack Kirby. It's just called King Kirby with Crystal Skillman.
My wife and I wrote it. Yep.
Can you tell me about the play, which due to this pandemic I will never see?
But you can go to iTunes right now.
Yeah.
And search on King Kirby, and it's now a 4-episode miniseries audio, thanks to our pals at IEA Podcasting, with the original New York City cast. It's about the life of Jack Kirby, starting with his childhood in the tenements of Manhattan and creating Captain America, fighting in France during World War II, creating romance comics on Marvel, and sort of why and how his legacy got, shall we say, obscured by some of the other people in his life.
Got a couple of friends who actually told me, who non-comics friends, or maybe casual comics friends, who said that they saw the play a year ago.
Okay.
And ever since then, whenever they go watch a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie and Stan makes his cameo, they loudly boo.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of Stan's actions vis-a-vis Jack do deserve a bit of booing. So, I mean, I grew up loving Marvel Comics and loving sort of the Stan Lee voice, the editorial voice. And unfortunately, when you grow up and you sort of realize that things aren't necessarily the way they were presented to you. And I love the I think I still have my childhood copy of The Origin of Marvel Comics by Stan Lee over there. And while he gives credit to Jack, he definitely makes it seem like, he sort of came up with all these kind of high concepts totally on his own. And Jack has definitely complicated a lot of that. Steve Ditko obviously created a lot of stuff as well. So I just was sort of fascinated by Jack Kirby's life story, and I tried to do a biography, and then I did a draft play. I was dating a playwright at the time, later became my wife, and she was like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And I was like, congratulations, you're now my co-writer. And that play has had a nice little life. And we had a recording of it from 2014. And when we were approached by a podcasting company, little startup studio, wondering about the audio rights, we were like, well, not only will we give you the audio rights, we actually have a recording of the show from with the original cast, and which has now been digitally remastered, and all this music and sound effects have been added. So it's a really terrific podcasting drama. The first episode dropped on the 7th, and then every Wednesday in October, you're going to get a new episode until it's done. Is
Jack Kirby your favorite ever?
Comics guy? I mean, probably at this point.
Okay.
At this point, I've read. It's so hard for me to rank these folks because I've been influenced by so many. I already mentioned Steve Gerber. Grant Morrison would be somebody else. Jack Jackson, the great nonfiction comics underground cartoonist.
Because I was just thinking, if you were inspired to create the whole thing about him, then
Well, it's just, I'm a storyteller, right? It's just a compelling story. You know what I mean? It's just an amazing story. The fight to get his artwork back. He created so many different comics mediums. He was one of the first. This isn't really in the play, but he was one of the first creators to use the direct market to do creator-owned comics.
Really?
He's just kind of everywhere.
Okay.
With this,
I did not know that.
with the series called Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers.
Oh, that was one of the first direct market comics.
Yep, from Pacific.
Very cool. And my next section is I'm a very big Spider-Man fan.
Excellent.
And there was a very long stretch.
As am I should say. It was a dream come true to be one of the guys writing Amazing Spider-Man.
I should hope you were a Spider-Man fan. But yeah, it was a long period when I wasn't reading Spider-Man, but then Brand New Day brought me back. You came in a little late. So what was it like working with a brain trust at the time?
It was fun. We'd get together every 6 months they moved us around a lot. Like we were Marvel's lawyers. I think we were at ABC once. Another part of the Disney empire, and then we would meet at Marvel. It was fun, guys. I really enjoyed working with all those guys, and the editors were always terrific, and it was a really, really fun experience.
Was it hard to stay coordinated?
Yes, it was. But it worked for the most part. Like there's a lot of I think stuff that it just was a lot. Everyone was all the artists worked at different paces, right? So you needed scripts. How Steve Wacker and Tom Brennan managed not to kill themselves, I just think is a testament to the resiliency of the human spirit, because it was a challenge.
I think you displayed like a wide range of a wide range of your skill set on that book, because you start with a spot and it's a very pretty funny story that is also poignant. Kind of a depressing story, poignant story, which seems
that story got me the job. I was technically not even a member of the team at that point. I just did that as a one shot, as a fill-in essentially.
And it seems directly influenced by a Grant Morrison story from Animal Man. Is that fair?
I mean, a little bit. There's the bit where the Spot tries to write a note to Spidey, and I guess that was a callback to the Coyote Gospel Chuck Jones reference, of course.
And
Grant Morrison.
You have Spider-Man doing that whole Batman voice. I thought that was really funny.
That was fun.
But the next story you wrote had the Chameleon, and you used Michelle Gonzalez, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I'm the biggest fan of Michelle Gonzalez in the world. I think
I used her. I ended up using her quite a lot.
Yeah. What do you think of her?
I thought she was a little obnoxious. I didn't create her, and so I guess it just like the whole idea of Spider-Man having a roommate seemed like such a bad idea for him, not necessarily a bad idea for stories, but like if I'm Peter Parker, like living with essentially a stranger is a terrible idea. And so I sort of looked for various ways to complicate that relationship,
including having the Chameleon and her kind of hook up.
Yes, exactly. That was a controversial decision by many, but I stand by that story.
Yeah, I saw that. I didn't even really think about it until I saw the people discussing it. But I'm like, the Chameleon is a villain. That's what he does.
He dips people in acid. He's a terrible man.
Yeah. That was another
Kids,
thing.
don't be like the Chameleon.
Exactly. I was like, don't be like the Chameleon. I think that's a takeaway here. But yeah, my ranking of Spider-Man love interests is all in direct proportion to how terrible they are for him, and she's so terrible for him. She's so terrible for him because she's so terrible. That's why she's one of my favorites. But you also had Spider-Man get together with Carly Cooper in preparation for Dan Slott's run. And I did.
It's very hard for me to take responsibility for much of that, because that was all basically tying off other people's storylines and putting Dan in the best position to start his run.
Oh, so was that an editorial request or a Dan request?
I do not remember. It was definitely not a Fred request. So someone, I think, or maybe I'm completely misremembering that, because because I don't remember. Sorry.
So here's my question: of all of the possible love interests that were introduced for him in Brand New Day, if you had had your way, who would he have been kissing at the end there?
That's a great question. I always liked the Black Cat relationship. I've got to say, I've always dug Black Cat as a character. I was doing Web of Spider-Man at the same time I was doing Amazing Spider-Man, and I had a fun, in my opinion, fun story where Mary Jane and Black Cat had to team up and rescue Spider-Man. I thought that was a fun story. I like the Black Cat. I feel like if I as a kid, I was reading Amazing Spider-Man, but then because I like Todd McFarlane's art from the Hulk. So I was reading the Peter David Hulk, and then I jumped over to Spider-Man. I guess I've been reading Amazing up until that point, but Amazing was kind of a mess in the 80s until David Michelini and Todd McFarlane took it over. And I didn't really care for the stories. Not a huge Michelini fan. Todd's art just got too cartoony for me, and there was something about being married to a supermodel that I just thought was a bit like much for Peter Parker. Was always part of his appeal was he was kind of a sad sack everyman, but now he was married to a gorgeous rich woman.
Yeah,
and it sort of changed the dynamic of the strip for me to the point where I just kind of lost interest in it.
Yeah, that's a controversial thing Spider-Man fans fight about.
Well, and then
I don't know if you've heard.
I mean, clearly you and I are in the minority because he spent the entire decade of the 90s married to her, and then the first 5, 6, 7 years of this millennium. So I just, it just was something that I never really was that particularly interested in. And then I joined the team and started writing the book, and then you just get these waves of hate from the internet, and it was just like, these are made up people.
These
Why are we fighting it?
Why are we fighting about this? Characters.
It's like, if you don't like it, don't read it. It's not rocket science. Like, I just don't. It's like, and they just would watch the sales figures, and whether there was a dip, they were like, it's because Mary Jane isn't in the book anymore.
Oh my God, that drives me nuts because the Spider-Man, when Brand New Day happened, the recession hit at the same time.
Sure.
The economic recession. And they were pointing to Spider-Man sales as, they were like, okay, it's because Mary Jane's not in the book anymore. And I'm like, all comics are down.
Well, and what's funny is I just completely forgot about this. That my Chameleon storyline was called, sort of forced on me, that we had to call it the Redheaded Stranger because it was the storyline where Mary Jane came back into Peter's life, and no one gave a shit. Like, everyone just talked about the Chameleon, as I knew they would, because I'm like, who are they going to focus on, Mary Jane or the guy dipping people in acid? I think they're going to stick with the acid guy, and it just drove me nuts because they Marvel just was like, you've got to call it Redhead Stranger, and we got to make a big deal that Mary Jane is coming back, and they slapped Mary Jane on to this day, the paper, the hardcovers got Mary Jane and a Vespa, very nice Adi Granov painting. It's lovely, but it's like, it has nothing to do with, Mary Jane is a kind of important person in the story, but not really. So just bashed my head in on the wall with that. Javier Polito and I did this lovely story that was just about Mary Jane. The White Rabbit appears in, one of my favorite lame Spider-Man villains. And they bumped it to, like, it was supposed to be 601, but then, like, no, Mark Waid is going to do 601, and they bumped it to 605. And I'm like, why? Like, why are we reintroducing her and then doing this flashback story? And I was just like tearing my hair out. So so that's definitely an example of being, but I was the new guy, so I wasn't going to say anything,
Yeah, it's okay. It all worked out for the best.
It all worked out for the best. That is totally true.
Had a lot of fun, Fred. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Good luck with everything. Hopefully we can do this again soon when you get
absolutely. And remember, just search King Kirby on iTunes, or it's on Spotify. It's really wherever you get podcasts.
Yeah, and the comic book history of animation starts
November 22nd or whatever that Wednesday.
The Wednesday of November 22nd.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.